I'd like to share with you some insight if you want to excel in EU's competency-based interviews. And these interviews are based on the EPSO Competency Framework, which has some 8 core competencies, and then each of these 8 competencies has its own anchors. Competency-based interviews are also called the behavioral interviews and also the leadership interviews. Okay, so where do I come from? I coach people for Amazon interviews for over 8 years, and Amazon uses a similar system of behavioral competencies. They call them the leadership principles, and the interviewing technique is quite the same. So I thought I'd share with you some insight on what it takes to excel with behavioral interviews. Being able to answer any competency-based question does not guarantee you're going to pass that job interview. In fact, these interviews are the only types of interviews where they can share the questions in advance, and still you would be far from guaranteed from passing those interviews, because in a behavioral interview, the difference is not made in your ability to answer questions, but in the quality of your answers or the quality of your stories, so to speak. All right, so this being said, how do you prepare for these competency-based interviews? There's 2 ways you'd want to go around this. The first and the most common approach that people use to prepare these interviews would be to look for lists of possible interview questions, which you would want to role play. Okay, this is the quickest method, especially if you want to gain a little bit of confidence in your interviewing skills. If you're 3 days before your interview and you know you cannot invest a lot of time, also, a role play is always a good idea to tune up your interviewing skills, but it's a very reactive approach. Remember what I said, the bar in behavioral interviews is not in your ability to answer any question, but rather how well you answer them, right? And this brings me to the second approach to prepare these competency or behavioral interviews, that is to prepare a story bank and to role play those stories that you prepare. What do I mean by story bank? To prepare highlights from your professional expertise around those core competencies and their anchors, right? Each of those stories, let's say 10 stories for a mid-level role, 15 or 25 stories for senior leadership types of roles, you would want to revise those stories at least 3 times. Okay, one revision could be a role play. So there's only 2 things that matter in a competency-based interviews: your stories and your ability to communicate them, right? The story bank and the role play. You cannot do one without the other. If you don't have the stories, you can be a perfect motivational speaker, but you lack substance. Similarly, you can have a great list of stories, a 50-page document with all your stories, but unless you can communicate them clearly, again, you cannot pass this interview. So this is why the magic formula would be to combine story building with role play. Right? What is the best format to present your stories in a competency-based interview? The STAR format is a perfectly plausible, perfectly capable format for most candidates. It's a great fit, especially for more junior types of roles, because this is the easiest way to ensure a bit of clarity in your communication. Now, what happens is, and I'm doing this for over 8 years, a quick shortcut, a quick improvement to your STAR answers would be to mix the situation and task, because what happens is most candidates, especially early on in your prep process, you will have a tendency to front load your answers. In other words, you will go for too long, present the situation and task, and then you're going to be left with too little time to present the action and results. So this is why you'd want to combine them. Now, if you're applying for a senior or leadership role, the expectation is that you would come up with your own format. Okay, so the DAN format, for instance, description, action, and some nuggets. In my experience coaching people for various levels, from directors at Netflix to software engineers at Amazon, it's not such a great deal. It's not such a big deal to come up with your own format that would help you to sell yourself on your strength, right? So the best format differs by role, but if you could come up with your own, that would also be perfectly plausible, right? What makes a great story for a behavioral competency, and why doesn't it suffice to know the questions to give great answers. To give an example, let's take learning as a core competency. For example, if you're a developer, how did you spend time learning how to code from your favorite YouTube channel, right? An exceptional answer on learning would highlight you as someone being able to learn from multiple sources. Hey, you know what? I learn all the time. I learn from that YouTube channel. I learn from this resource. I learn using AI. I learn from these courses. Learning from multiple sources is an element, a differentiator from good to great answers to behavioral interviews around learning. So you can imagine these tricks are present in pretty much all the competencies and all the rubrics that they have to scan for during your behavioral interviews, because what they share with you is those model of behavioral competencies, or 8 competencies, each of them with specific notes. What they do not share with you is how they're going to evaluate on each of those competencies. Now, with respect to the role play, it's always good advice that you role play as soon as possible when you start preparing for these interviews, because that will yield some interesting insight, some valuable insight as to how good you are with your interviewing skills. It's perfectly possible you are a great communicator, you're a great speaker, and you don't feel like there's much value for you, and you would want to focus on your story bank. But what you want to avoid is you over-prepare your story bank, and then you'll struggle communicating it during a job interview. Okay, I have a simple question for you. How long should your answers be in a job interview? If your answer is 1 or 2 minutes at most, then to me that tells me you're not really that great with these job interviews, simply because I know over time that the best candidates I've had would always take their time, be it 15 seconds or 5 minutes or 15 minutes, sometimes to communicate the idea that they wanted to transmit clearly and efficiently, right? So knowing how long you should take to answer these interview questions and knowing how to sell yourself in these job interviews is a critically important skill you would want to build as a result of role play. Now, how do you achieve this skill? Whether using an interview coach or a friend, colleague, you do it in the mirror, that's very much up to you. But I'm just presenting you the options and the different levels of proficiency with these things. Finally, why would people fail these behavioral interviews? Nowadays, most candidates fail behavioral interviews because they cheat in them. And the most common way to cheat these days in behavioral interviews is using AI rewarded interview answers. This is more common than most candidates realize, and this is the first thing that any professional interviewer would look for when screening an interview candidate. The second most common way to cheat in behavioral interviews is to invent metrics or invent decisions or invent a conflict with a colleague or with the manager, which again, usually do not end up well, right? Another common reason to not to do well in behavioral interviews is what I also mentioned previously, with overthink, over-theorize these behavioral interviews. You would end up with a 50-page document, even 100 pages document in some cases, which you won't be able to communicate simply because you overthought the story building process. 95% of candidates going into a behavioral interview cannot build a story bank that's good enough by their own standards. Keep that in mind. The second thing you should pay particular attention to here is that these models of behavioral competencies, the framework, the competency-based framework, is built by the EU for the EU. This is something that works well for them. And with any other major company, Amazon has them, Google has them, Netflix also has their culture deck. So this is something normal in any large organization to have their models of behavioral competencies, which they use also with their employees. Why this is important? Because usually, if you look a little bit between the lines of those 8 competencies and their subsections, you realize that's more like 30 to 40 behaviors or competencies that you would have to prep for your job interview. And if you think of 30 or 40, your vacancy notice will mention 3 or 4 competencies that will be relevant to your interview, but still each of those 3 or 4 competencies will have 3 to 5 sub-competencies, which if you multiply by 3, again, there are 15 of them to prepare. So what my pitch is for you here is that it's not always that you fitting into their model of behavioral competence is the best for you, approach for you to prep. It very much depends on what you want to improve on. If your problem is communication skills, then your focus should be on role play. If your problem is that you cannot find stories that you want to share in job interviews, then you should focus on the story building process. But at no point in time have I said here you must focus on the EU's model of behavioral competencies that you try to fit as much as possible in them, right? So this is what you want to understand going into the job interviews. This is how you give the best qualitative types of answers, right? And finally, last but not least, should you smile? Because there's always this advice that, hey, have a positive attitude and be all smiles and optimistic in these job interviews. Listen, this worked quite well 5 years ago, but nowadays I would very much advise you to be yourself, try to deliver, try to sound as authentic as possible, because remember I said AI rewarded answers and bluffing are quite common these days, and the authenticity, in my experience, is what sells best. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.